flaw, he'll patch it silently and not tell any of the people who copied that flaw that they need to upgrade. Or when there's a flaw in the documentation of the chip from which people build these libraries, there's never any notice that anyone who built a library for this chip needs to go back and make sure that they did such and such right. So I'm going to start out with a whirlwind tour of Zigbee devices. I'm going to go very fucking quickly through that, and also through my second section on local Zigbee exploits, because those are things that I've covered in the past. The bulk of this lecture will be about a random number generator. It should not say timing. It's too late for me to fix slides. A pseudo-random number generator attack against the Texas Instruments ChipCon Z-Stack. This is used for Zigbee Smart Energy Profile implementation, usually in the case of end devices. So this could be used to hack into a thermostat or the home area network side of a smart meter. The gist of it is that if your random number generator is bad and you perform an EC-MQV key exchange, your private static key is exposed. So Mallory can have a conversation with Alice. The authentication will fail, but at the end of it, Mallory knows something about Alice's key. She does this 5 or 6 times and she's able to recover the key. And this was known cryptographically for quite a while. The cryptographic community had a paper published on it. It was largely ignored because it was theoretical. They said if by some magical means you were able to figure out the first 4 bits of the ephemeral private key, then you could recover the private static key. And they never described how you might get those 4 bits or why it was reasonable to expect those 4 bits. So when I discovered that the random number generator was bad, I did a quick search through a university library and bam, it's broken. Also, the vulnerability comes about if you implement the library exactly as the datasheet tells you to do. This is not something that came about because of a software designer making a mistake on his own. The software designer trusts the hardware designer's description and documentation of a device without actually knowing how it functions. So on this chip, there's a hardware register that you can just read random bytes from. Those bytes aren't actually random, and there's very little documentation about it. Also, this was fixed silently, and there is still no official announcement that you should upgrade or patch your existing code. There's no errata listing this as a problem. In embedded systems, it's common to have an errata sheet that describes all of the analog and digital flaws in a chip, and there's no mention there. Come to Josh Wright's talk tomorrow. He'll be talking about different Zigbee things. And an hour isn't much time, so I'm going to go very quickly. Wireless sensors are sometimes called Zigbee as slang because the official word would be IEEE 802.15.4 class low power wireless sensor network device, which is too long, but it's also a specific standard set. And in this lecture, I'll be talking about the Zigbee Smart Energy Profile, which adds extra cryptography onto the base of Zigbee because the default cryptography is not very good. It's longer range than near field RFID, but it's sometimes also called RFID as slang. And the idea is that if you have a very small computer, which is here on the right, and a very small radio, which is there on the left, and an antenna, and a battery, which would plug in over here, or it can run from a solar cell, you can have a computer running wirelessly on a network for months or years, so long as it doesn't have to transmit very often or very much. The peak bandwidth for this is about 256 kilobytes per second, and in practice, you would never sustain that for very long. You only do a burst transmission, and then you turn back off. This is a competing vendors development kit. Here you have a single chip in the center of the board, which is both an ARM microcontroller and a Zigbee radio. This is a water meter from the city of Paris, or actually a radio repeater for one. So you have a radio chip on each side of the board, And as you can see, the whole thing is encased in epoxy. They also have them in smart electric meters. The older interface was infrared, which you can see here at the bottom. The infrared light shows up on the camera as blue. So the right eye is transmitting, and the left eye is a phototransistor that's receiving. But there's also a Zigbee radio for communication with devices in the home. This is called the Home Area Network, or HAN. And there's a separate network, which is vendor-specific, that speaks within the neighborhood as a whole. And that is later connected to the electric company. You can use this for metering, for home automation. You can make landmines out of this, and that might at some point be required by international treaty, because when you have wireless sensor network as your landmines, you can issue them orders. You can tell them to turn off when the war is over. You can cause a ceasefire when friendly troops are moving across. You can have them identify friendly troops and refuse to commit friendly fire. And of course, all of these things can be hacked. So if you have a radio transponder on each soldier that keeps the landmines from blowing up, you can just sort of repeat those packets through a cellular network to make your own proxied transponder and weird stuff like that. Its only effective commercial applications at the time being are in children's toys and the electric meter industry. It was predicted that this technology would be in everything, that every coffee maker you bought would have it, that every device would work together, and that hasn't yet materialized. I am working on a network of 7 coffee makers for my apartment, though, such that you can order coffee on your way back to the apartment by text message or tweet. Whoa. All right. So in the history of Zigbee cryptography, you had 2 choices by the standard, and then you could break off from the standard and do your own thing. Of course, rolling your own cryptography is a sin, but all crypto implementations were rolled together by someone. So the classic choices were to either store your setup keys internally, but this requires that every device rolling off of the plant be pre-authorized for a particular distribution. So if an electric company only wants to allow its own certified thermostats to be connected, it can restrict that cryptographically by shipping keys within each unit. The other option is to send them over the air, which doesn't work very well when you aren't doing fancy asymmetric mumbo jumbo. So the smart energy profile was created to do a number of things, like standardize the packets and application layer for smart electric meters. But among that, they also created new cryptography. And through reasons, some of them legitimate, some of them not, the elliptic curve cryptography technology was chosen, over which Certicom claims a patent. So if you want to distribute one of these devices, you have to license it from Certicom. I think they're owned by RIM. And they require you to sign an NDA and a non-compete, and you have to go through a credit check to make sure that you have enough money to lose if they should decide to sue you for violating the prior two. Needless to say, I haven't licensed a copy. The early Zigbee devices were vulnerable to a number of local attacks. I took this photograph at Source Boston last year. This is a Zigbee chip on the left. These 3 pins are the SPI bus over which the microcontroller talks to the radio. If you tap them with hypodermic syringes, you can watch packets go from the microcontroller to the radio and back. The radio, not the microcontroller, implements AES-128. There is a command that says, use this AES-128 key, and it's followed by the key. This is a command byte coming across. There's a similar pattern for the clock line, and you only tap 2 at once because you're usually getting only the traffic in one direction if you're trying to grab keys. You'll use 3 syringes if you want a full capture. And then there are handy tools for taking this capture, deciphering the bytes from it, and then you have an electronic log, which you can search for the command that sets the AS128 key. You can also attack software within the chip, and some of the software is not removable. This is a photograph I took in Texas of the masked ROM of the MSP430 2274. These little dots here are actually vias connecting multiple layers of cross-connect, and every tall column is a bit of significance. There are 16 columns here because there are 16 bits in an MSP430 word, and this is an executable program of about 1 kilobyte, as well as meta information about the chip, such as its model number and revision. This was taken by dropping 5 chips in boiling nitric acid, and then to remove the packaging, and then dropping the same 5 chips without packaging and with the pins having been plucked off by tweezers into hydrofluoric acid, a 5% solution that was also boiling, and removing 1 every minute. The chip, which was timed at 3 or 4 minutes, I forget which, was the one that was perfectly etched. So it removes enough of the glass from above the ROM to allow for a clear photograph without removing the ROM itself. So I built this device, the BSL cracker, which exploits a timing vulnerability in the bootloader. And because the bootloader is in masked ROM, it's always there to attack. There's a way to disable it, but these 2 chips on the right can fluctuate the power supply to make the chip drop out of the disable while loop. It's like while disabled semicolon, if you were to imagine it in C. And if it ever screws up the jump back to the start of the body of the loop, then it falls into exactly where it would go if it hadn't been disabled. You can extract memory with a debugger. This is the GoodFet 10. I'm now up to the 22 and the 31. And I've got plenty of these boards to give away if you do surface mount soldering. The idea is that you can have a debugger, run a cable over to any sort of board, and then connect to it as a debugger, single step it, dump memory, things like that. This can be disabled. There are ways of getting around the disabling. You can fluctuate the power supply to make it think that its fuse has not been blown. Once it passes that check, it will continue on and let you read memory as if everything were grand. The newer chips, this one here, actually stores the enable or disable word in flash memory. And if it's all zeros or all ones, which are the most likely things to read during a failed fetch, then you have complete access. So if you just enter JTAG debugging with the voltage too low for the chip or too high for the chip, then you're in. And you can use this to repurpose devices. This is a children's toy that I wrote an example firmware image for that a friend of mine, Mike Osman, later turned into a spectrum analyzer for sub-gigahertz. So you can buy this toy for $15, write new software into it, and have your own spectrum analyzer. It's about as powerful as a Y-Spy, but a lot more bubbly. You can do a cold boot attack. So in this device here, which uses the ChipCon 1110, and anything else that uses a ChipCon radio with a microcontroller built into it, RAM is not defended while flash is. So you can connect with the debugger and sort of wipe out the entire chip to write new software into it. When you do this, RAM survives. So you just send the command to erase the chip. This is the exact command line command you would run in Unix. And then you just dump it out to a file, and then you can search that file for the keys or strings or anything else that you think might be within memory. RAM is small. I think we calculated it would take about 4 seconds in Python to try every symmetric key that might be in the RAM. This is a random number generator test for the ChipCon radio. And it's at a period of 7 FFE, so it's skipping a lot of words in between. You'll note that if you go diagonally, 9064, 9064, 9064, 9064, every row is a different sampling, and the random numbers are repeated. And they're repeated every 32,000 and change numbers. This is because there's a 16-bit linear feedback shift register, which is creating all of the random numbers used for key generation. And they're dropping half of it and it gets stuck in one of two redundant cycles because they're dropping either the high part or the low part. So there are only 32,000 or 15 bits worth of starting positions that it might go through in any circuit. This means that the ephemeral key is predictable. In MQV, you generate a unique session key, which you use in addition to your static key for the key exchange. The idea here is that you know the public key because it's given to you as part of the exchange, and you can generate a lookup table, and from the lookup table you can get the ephemeral private key. And by the Leadbitter attack, which I'll get to in a bit, when you have the ephemeral private key, you can then work your way backward to find the static private key. So as this attack will work, the attacker, Mallory, will begin a key negotiation with the victim, Alice. During this key negotiation, Mallory will carefully choose her own public and private key pair to expose individual pieces of the private key. She can make it very small or very large to get a chosen point along the curve. And the victim doesn't realize that this isn't an authorized key until after the exchange has already taken place. And then the shared secret, which Mallory derives, Alice throws out the shared secret and abandons the negotiation attempt. But the shared secret that Mallory derives, combined with the known ephemeral keys of both parties, and Mallory's own known static keys, which can also be chosen in the attack, and the static public key, which is known to Mallory. The only piece missing in that equation is the static private key, and you can work backward to find this. So wherever the ephemeral key is known, the static key can also be extracted in this key exchange. This property is not true of other protocols. In RSA, it's only necessary to ensure that the nonce is never repeatable by an attacker. It's not necessary to keep it private. The algorithm itself used to be part of NSA's Suite B. It was dropped, but there wasn't much of a comment on why. It is sort of a performance hack in that you can use a shorter key. Elliptic curve allows this always. So you wind up passing a 190-bit key around instead of a 1024-bit key, but you get similar levels of security. That's not enough of a performance hack, so ECMQV goes a little bit further. And it does both key validation and shared secret generation in a single pass. So instead of having to first go through and make sure that the public key is signed by the certificate authority, and then go back through and generate a shared secret, you can instead throw it all into one magic little crypto function and be done with it. But this is sold by Certicom, and it might be patented. So none of the Zigbee vendors will actually ship this library directly. They each have their own special email address at certicom.com. So if you want to purchase this library for Ember's product, you email ember@certicom.com. If you want it for ChipCons, you email chipcon@certicom.com. And they're all using the either the same library or forks of the same library in distribution, which means that if you find a bug in one, you can easily port it to another. If there are timing attacks in this code, and there probably are, it will apply similarly to all of them. So in the case of Alice and Bob doing a key exchange, they each have a static key pair which is shipped with them from the factory. And this is generated on a server in the sky, the same way you'd buy an SSL certificate. You also have to purchase these from Certicom. So these are not generated on the device, and their randomness is not compromised by the problems in the pseudorandom number generator. the ephemeral key pair is compromised. And the initial seed of the random number generator isn't that bad. It's weird, but it's not that bad. So in the case of this, it's not that you wouldn't be able to predict where the random number generator starts. It's that you can enumerate all starting positions in a single lookup table. During a regular exchange, Alice knows Bob's static public key and ephemeral public key, as well as the certificate authority's certificate. All of the devices within a network will share a single certificate authority. So if you begin with one CA, it's very difficult to switch the network over to supporting 2. And all of the ephemeral keys come from the pseudorandom number generator, so you have 2 to the 16th power, about 65,000 total possible keys. If you're grabbing them from the same device repeatedly, you will only see 2 to the 15th, or half of those. And the shared secret is generated by a hashing function to create an AES key, which always looks random, because you wind up with the combined entropy of both Alice and Bob. So if you just dump the AES keys that are being used, you have 2 16-bit PRNGs being combined, plus 2 static keys, which are 190 bits random, being combined. And this all goes through a hash function at the end, so you wind up with random-looking AES keys. If you were just to audit that part, you would never notice this. The break itself came from Peter Ledbetter and Nigel Smart at ISC in 2003. The paper is entitled Analysis of the Insecurity of ECMQV with Partially Known Nonces. The conclusion of the paper is that they show it to be insecure for key sizes less than 2 to the 320th. That's 320 bits in elliptic curve style, which is, does anyone know? 3,000 bits by the RSA measure. In any case, they found this if the attacker is able to gain a small number of bits of each ephemeral key generated by his victim. In our case, we know all of them, every last bit, because we can generate a lookup table between them. And for a key length of 2 to the 160th, the 4 most significant bits were sufficient to recover the key. So I wanted this list of random numbers, and the documentation of the chip isn't sufficient to recreate the LFSR. Like, they don't include all of the taps and starting positions and things like that. So I just wrapped the library in C code, which is here on the left. I'll publish the slides so you can grab these from the blog article. Basically, all this does is it has a while loop that sets a flag as to whether or not it's ready to be harvested. And then the debugger single steps until the harvest pool is complete. Then it copies that pool out to the host, and it does the same thing over again. Here on the right, I have, so the left is C code running inside of one chip of the type that I'm trying to attack. Here on the right, I have Python code for the GoodFet. This runs on the host computer, and all it does is watch these same flags and perform the single stepping. Down here at the bottom is the GoodFet 11. This is the hardware that I used. Up here at the top, you can see a hex dump of the binary file, and I grepped for some bytes in the beginning. You can see how it's repeated every 8,000 hex, and it just shifts left by 1 byte because there is a single dead state that it never quite goes through. If the pool ever becomes 0, 0, 4 zeros in hex, it will get stuck there. So it avoids that naturally in its cycling. I have a dandy little portable application to demonstrate this. And I did a strange attractors graph. I'm not sure who first came up with this, but the idea is that if you just do a histogram of these bytes, it's flat. Like, they look statistically random. But if you do an XY scatter plot of successive bytes, where X is the first byte you sample, Y is the second byte you sample, you get these snowflake patterns. The same happens in 3D if you do XYZ. And this works for any random number generator based upon a linear feedback shift register. So this same thing has been used for port choices on operating systems. If you want to know whether a DNS port is guessable, you can dump the lot of them through packet sniffing and repeated queries, and then you can draw this graph to figure out how predictable they are. As far as the PRNG quality, 16 bits is a very short sequence. Only half of these are exercised within any given boot. So once you reboot it, it picks either the left set or the right set, and it never switches between those because it's sampling 2 pairs at a time and then throwing one of them out. This isn't exactly the same sequence as you would get from the LFSR alone, because even in the random number generator, they're throwing away things that might be random. The position is exposed by random backoff delays. So if this were the 1980s and you were doing this on a Commodore 64 and you couldn't afford to keep a 20 megabyte lookup table because you didn't want to waste your RAID array on it, you could instead figure out where it is within the random number generator by watching for random backoff delays. So you cause a packet collision through jamming, and you can hold that there until you release it. Then you measure the amount of time between you're releasing the jamming and the first packet being broadcast. That time is controlled by the last sample of the LFSR. And then you run through through the entire random number generator sequence until you find that time, and then you know exactly what's going to be used for the next key negotiation. None of this is necessary, of course, because 20 megabytes is now trivial. The random number generator itself was documented first in the ChipCon 1110, 2430, and older single chip devices. As I showed you in the earlier slides, the first devices were a radio which could be set next to a microcontroller. This is the second generation of chips, the first ones that contain a microcontroller on the same die. It's an Intel 8051 clone. So at first it was suggested just for collision avoidance and random delay, and for that it works splendidly. You can use 3 or 4 assembly instructions taking fewer than 10 cycles to get a number that's random enough to prevent accidental collisions. The problem came about with the ChipCon 2530, which is their most recent 8051 model. They've since switched to the Texas Instruments MSP430 core. Although they copied the bug over, and I'll get to that in a bit. So in the 2530 data sheet, they discovered that they needed a random number generator for cryptography. So as I imagine it, an engineer in Germany is handed informal documentation by the guy who actually designed the chip in Norway, and then he needs to call up some guy he's never met in Texas to explain how random number generators are supported by this chip. And instead of having to write software for it, he says, oh, we have a random number generator. It says in the data sheet, hardware random number generator. And it did. So he writes up this little paragraph. The random number generator uses a 16-bit LFSR to generate pseudo-random number generators, which is true, which can be read by the CPU or used directly by the command strobe processor, which is also true. There's a second little microcoded processor in this chip that you can use if you want to generate weird patterns for radio things, and you can sample it directly by that. So if you needed to scatter it or something, you might be able to do useful things with that. Then the last sentence is where it screws up. He says that it can be used to generate random keys for use in security. And this data sheet was read by all of the software developers who were making software for this. So if you grab the example code for this chip, both the standard libraries, it's called a hardware extraction library, or HAL. It's sort of the equivalent of the C standard library, but for hardware interaction. So it allows you to access the radio registers and things like that. Inside of the HAL, they included this as the random number generator function. So now you have a what might have been a decent design in Norway, getting poorly documented in Germany, and then copied by a software developer in Texas as an example to be copied by everyone on Earth trying to write an operating system for this chip in minimal time. When I showed you the pink children's toy, I wrote the operating system for that in one evening. And you can bet that I didn't double check the random number generator until later. So all of the example software for this, from the hardware extraction library, which still has not been patched, all the way up to their reference implementation of Zigbee, which they give away for anyone trying to generate a Zigbee device using their chip, contains this same vulnerability. And it gets copied at each stage. The Zigbee stack designer copied it from the HAL library designer, who copied it from the data sheet, who copied it from an internal memo somewhere. And at each stage, it just gets deeper into these products. And if you change the data sheet now, the product has already been designed and shipped. The library has already been designed and shipped to product developers. And it's been copied in between. The version control internally with these sorts of firms is just now going over to revision control systems instead of emailing zip files. The bootloader that I showed you a picture of earlier, it was done by the copied zip file method, and you can actually see where vulnerabilities were fixed and then reintroduced as they needed to recover the space or as files got shuffled up. So they finally fixed this in February of 2010 for their Zigbee stack, not in their documentation and not in the HAL library or any of the other examples. The way that this infects the Certicom library, because remember, Certicom claims a patent on the cryptography used by this, and they demand that it be in a separate module, which gets statically linked in only after it has been purchased separately with the NDAs and paperwork and stuff. So they call this the Zigbee security engine, and every chip vendor has their own name for this. So Ember calls it something else, and I'm not sure what Freescale calls it. It takes pointers to the key pairs, and then it also takes a getRandom function, and it uses this to generate the ephemeral key. So this third parameter here, ZCL general key establishment getRandom. All this does is grab bytes from the bad pseudorandom number generator. The exploit sequence is that Mallory authenticates with Alice. Alice provides her public keys. Mallory provides chosen keys. So Mallory can make up any static and any ephemeral key pair she likes. It does not have to be signed. And she can choose this to expose whatever information she wants of Alice's keys. She then looks up Alice's ephemeral private key in her 20 megabyte SQLite database. And then she calculates Alice's static private key using Leadbitter's technique. And she can now impersonate Alice. So during any other ECMQV exchange, she can present Alice's public key, knowing Alice's private key. And because the public key is signed by the certificate authority, everything works out. And note that her private static key is exposed. So, I mean, this is her identification. And Mallory does not need a valid certificate to begin with. They aren't terribly hard to get, though. If you want one, you just erase the flash of the chip, dump RAM, and search it. There's a single C struct, which contains the key pair, and it's always the same distance from the certificate authority cert. And that bug still hasn't been fixed a year and a half after it was reported in the example libraries. Some of the individual vendors have fixed that, though, so, but not the examples. In any case, patching this is really hard. It's a common thing in IT security lectures, especially the introductory ones, to say you've got to keep your system up to date and patched and roll things out and all of this other gung-ho crap. In embedded systems, you as the customer do not have the option. If I have a network of 10,000 electric meters that have this vulnerability or any other, I have to go to my device vendor and I have to say, hey, look, I think you might have this problem. Talk to your vendor to get a fixed version of the library. Because everything is statically linked and copied and pasted from examples, you can't update a single library as you would on a PC. Instead, there is a single application running. In many cases, you don't even have preemptive multitasking. The best you'll have is a single interrupt firing. And to patch this without your immediate vendor's cooperation requires that you dump the firmware, disassemble it, patch it, and reload it. And if the JTAG fuse is blown and there's no bootloader or remote update mechanism, then there's no way to replace the software, even if the vendor is willing to write you new software. So then you find yourself in the position of having to live with the problem or replace 100,000 devices. And if the warranty only covers a single replacement, you might wait a decade to do that. A good random number generator isn't that hard to build. You just throw analog measurements into a SHA-1 hash, and you keep it spinning for a while. Or you can use the hardware AES implementation of the chip to do the same thing. And then in this case, the computation is actually hardware accelerated. And because you're doing this during the key exchange, you don't need the AES unit for anything else. And the hardware entropy sources exist everywhere in these chips. You just create a little bit of noise on an analog input pin, and you have everything you'll need. You can also use the analog noise that comes in through the radio. So you just listen to static and feed that in. Don't listen to the signal strength of static. That's coming up in another lecture. So this was patched in February. The applications using it also have to be patched separately by the vendor that built them, and everything on the network has to be patched. So not only your meter, but also your thermostat, your refrigerator, your washer, your dryer, your everything that's connected to the Zigbee network you wish to defend. And the cold boot vulnerability remains. I can connect, erase the chip, dump the RAM, and grab the key from everything written remotely like the example firmware. Dealing with competitors, Ember ZNet Pro. Ember was a software development company that later went into hardware design. Their first generation of hardware chips sucked. Their second generation is quite good. When I released the random number generator vulnerability, I got an email from Ember within a day saying that they'd checked their code and they were not similarly vulnerable. I'd already checked their code with ARM's OBJDump, and they were correct. The deal is that it grabs a couple of random number radio, and then it feeds that into an AES 128 loop. And it reseeds every now and then to ensure that the pool remains proper. The Certicom library is a problem because if it has a timing attack, everybody has a timing attack, and everyone has the same timing attack. And I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to race the next 3 slides. Certicom could have fixed this problem if Texas Instruments did not, but doing so would have made the library larger. Perhaps if they had implemented a testing mode, which would just ensure that the random numbers were not crap, that could be swapped out for deployment, this would fix things. The other problem is that because it requires an NDA, a no-compete agreement, and a credit check, and anyone writing a competing library is actively threatened with lawsuits for patent violation, a lot of vendors won't implement the crypto library. They won't ship it. And if anyone on the network is not using it, then you've got to downgrade a bit. Microchip's SSL stack is used in the Google Power Meter, which is not a Zigbee device. The Google Power Meter device is actually a web API. So if you're in web hacking and you want to start playing with power meters, you'll be able to do that very soon. Their reference implementation uses the Microchip SSL stack, which uses SHA-1 pseudo-random number generator. At first I thought this was exploitable, but now I'm convinced that it's not. It's seeded by a 1-byte timer and a 1-byte MAC address. And this is done on every packet reception. So the entropy begins very small, but it grows quickly. This would have been exploitable, except that RSA is a lot better than ECMQV when it comes to a bad nonce. The only bad state as far as an RSA random number is when an attacker can actually control which number is sampled. I started a mailing list called Smart Grid Skunkworks on Google Groups as a security back channel for embedded systems engineers working with Zigbee and smart meters. This is a place in which you can post an anonymous question. Hey, will this lead to problems later? Things like that. And it also allows for vulnerability announcements. So the people designing these products can receive the information about how the libraries they've copied are vulnerable so that they know when they need to upgrade when their vendors aren't telling them. If you'd like to join the fun, you can download most of these. I think ZNet Pro requires a vendor account, but Ember is quite friendly and they might give you one if you're friendly too. You can also grab a good vet board from me, and you can purchase the Girltech IME for 15 bucks and have all sorts of fun with it. To conclude, this hasn't yet been fixed. The replacement of the vulnerable code is going to take several years. And by that point, the Zigbee Smart Energy profile itself might fade away. Crypto is hard, and it shouldn't be assumed to be done properly just because it's complicated. And also, a single vulnerable device in the network breaks the promises offered by certificates in the same way that a single rogue certificate authority breaks the host side of things in SSL. Because here, the individual devices, rather than just servers in the sky, are being authenticated. And that's the end of the show. Are there any questions? Yes?
The XY graph that you showed of the around numbers
Yes.
there, do you have an example of what a proper random generator would look like in a graph like that?
Static.
Okay.
Proper after whitening looks like static. Proper before whitening looks like static, but sort of bent to the corners a little bit. So you wind up with either a star shape, if it's biased toward the low values, or you wind up with a sort of square shape with a missing diamond in the middle, if it's biased toward high numbers. So, I'll send you the scripts for generating that if you need it. Alrighty, thank you for your time. Oh, what? I can show you the diff later. What they did was they moved the random number generator function into the secret library that you get from Certicom, but only for cryptography. So they sort of passed the problem off to Certicom and called it a day. If you look through the new code, they just changed the relevant function to a function that they haven't given you. And you have to also upgrade your Certicom library in order to get this new function. So if you're trying to do a quick upgrade, you're going to have to hope that your contracts are in order to get the upgrade from a second vendor. And they also don't repair the HAL or system random number generator functions. So if you're using any random numbers for your own purposes within this application stack, you're still screwed. So.
They didn't actually change that at all. The same function is still there, it's just not being used for the generator.
Right. So the relevant diff is about 5 lines. Yeah. So it goes. Any other questions? Great. Thank you for your time.